Hello again, class from afar. I hope you are all well and enjoying some nice weather. This week we are going to talk about some evidence for evolution. And so what I mean by that is that, Darwin went on this journey and he noticed a bunch of things, and that led him to infer that animals have changed over time. And he developed his theory called the origin of species. So we still have a lot to talk about in terms of species, but we're going to talk today about other pieces of evidence that have led to this theory of evolution. And you have some notes in Google Classroom that you can fill out as we go, as well as an activity next. The next activity will be on the evolution of human skin color. And so that's kind of a cool example of natural selection at work. And we'll give you kind of a more specific example of how we look at these changes and decide that they're an adaptation, like they give a creature an advantage. So one thing you should know, this is a geology piece of information, but the law of superposition, that means that when we look at layers, this is the Grand Canyon, when we look at layers of sedimentary rock, the oldest layers are at the bottom, the youngest layers are at the top, and that's because this used to be an ocean, and so sediment settled, and then more and more and more and more. Pretty simple, but what it means is when people are looking for fossils in eastern Montana, it also is sedimentary rock like this, and that means they can find dinosaur fossils down here, and they don't find them higher up, and they know that the dinosaur is older based on which layer it's in. We're also talking about fossils, so you should know that fossils are pretty rare, and the reason they're rare is because the animal has to die and be buried. And in order to be buried efficiently, it usually has to die near water, near a lake or a river. And so it would die here and then get buried in the spring flood that carries all that sediment. And then it buries, and then it turns into a rock over time. So Gregory's always reading these books about dogs, like digging for T-Rex bones. Well, they're actually rock. So the dog wouldn't actually be very excited to find a T-Rex bone. So we have, we've got a lot of dinosaur fossils, even though they're kind of rare, and we have a lot of different types. So this is a fossilized tree, and I wish you were in class so I could show you some of the examples I have of this. But in terms of formation, all of these fossils got buried. This tree got buried, and then instead of the cells for a normal tree, those cells got replaced with what's called chert. It's a mineral. And so you can see that it's now a rock. Same thing, this looks like a femur from a dinosaur, but it's no longer actually organic material. It's not a bone. Now it's a rock because all of the organic things got replaced. This is a leaf imprint. These are imprints from what's called a cast. It's the opposite of an imprint. So it's an imprint that then got filled of this sea creature called an ammonite. We have dinosaur footprints, which are pretty crazy. There's a lot of places in the world where you can go see them. We have insects in amber. I have some in class that hopefully I'll get to show you sometime. We also have a mammoth rib bone at school that I'd like to show you. So all of these fossils got preserved. Some of these aren't changed. So these are actual remains. That's an actual tusk. It just got frozen. That's an actual mosquito. It just got trapped in amber. But the rest of these, they're not the actual organism anymore. Okay, so you should be able to say in your notes how fossils are formed, usually through burying, and then they turn into a rock. Take a look at this whale skeleton. So this is a modern sperm whale. If we were in class, I would have you look at it for a while, make some observations. But what do you see? So I hope you're looking down here. What do you notice about that? And what do you notice about this? So most students at some point will say, there's these bones that are just floating there. And that's actually a pelvis and a femur. So think about a hip bone and a leg bone. I mean, they're really small, but that's what they seem to be. Here, you have fingers, but no visible fingers up here. So these are a couple of the weird things that that biologists have noticed over time that make them think that's just a little strange. And we see the same things in dolphins. In this pilot whale, you see these little bones at the back that aren't attached to anything. We see fingers in the flippers. And so we also have a skeleton. This is an ancient creature called Ambulocetus, which means walking whale, nadans, and that means swimming. So it's like a walking whale that swims. And so the head structure looks pretty similar to this. Obviously, there's some differences. It kind of looks more crocodilian. It has shorter front legs, has the fingers, it has a pelvis still and leg bones. And so as we look at the fossil record, we see a progression of these organisms. So this is an artist's rendering of this creature. But a lot of the whales and ancient whales we have had small femurs, small back legs. And so the theory is, well, there was a land mammal. We don't know what it was. Some ancient creature, probably looked like this one, ended up being more in the ocean, and there was more and more selection, as in there was an advantage in having certain traits, and then those traits continue to get passed on through reproduction. And so these are all the organisms we have fossils of. And there's more in between as well. But here's that Ambulocetus one. And so we see this progression of losing limbs. So if you look at the back legs here, they get less and less prominent. So this one kind of has a tiny little leg. Dolphins, they don't appear to, but we know now that inside they do. And inside this whale they do. So kind of this strange progression. And all of this amounts, we're going to skip a few slides here. All of this amounts to our evidence from the fossil record. And what we see is that we see a similar anatomy, but we see a progression. So like we said for whales, we see the back legs getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The head is also changing too. The front legs are changing, but they're related enough to the one before it that it shows that they're closely related, that they have a common ancestor. So when you look at these horses too, when you look at the horses, especially if you look at the leg bones, right here it has 3 toes, and then as you move up, it turns into 1 toe. So horses run on the tips of their fingers and toes, and their ancient ancestors have several toes. Think like a rhino, and now they have 1. So we see from the fossils, we see a progression of size for horses. We see a progression of how the foot has changed. We see a progression of how the skull has changed. But you can see similarities in all of these creatures. And so that suggests that they have a common ancestor. Okay, you should be able to summarize that for fossil record. And now for geography in your notes. This is one of the things that Darwin noticed. He noticed that here in Ecuador, they have finches that are similar to the finches in the Galapagos Islands. And he's noticed that several times, that the tortoises too on the Galapagos resemble the tortoises in Ecuador. And so you'll find on islands organisms that are similar to the mainland. Well, why? Well, an individual must have flown or swam or floated to the islands from the mainland, and then it diverged from there. And we'll talk about that divergence next week. But what I mean by that is that different selection pressures cause different traits to become more prominent, and then they started becoming different species. So for geography, there's similar animals live near one another. We see that all the time. And animals on islands usually resemble those from a mainland. And that suggests that there's a common ancestor. So here's another example. We know that South America has alpacas and llamas, and Africa and Asia have camels, and they're related. They have similar stomach structures. They have similar eating habits. They look similar. They're all in the family Camelid. And that suggests, since especially these two, the kind of African and Middle East camel, the dromedary camel, is similar to the Bactrian camel. We've got one hump, we have two. There's differences, but they're close geographically. Well, that suggests that they have a common ancestor. And our theory is that there was a camel ancestor in the Americas, and it actually moved west. And there was a time where this crossing was exposed, either through ice or through low oceans. So for geography, if they are similar animals and they live near one another, it suggests that they have a common ancestor. Here's another example. This is a more ancient example, but we have the same fossils in South America and Africa. And the same fossil, this is the plant fossil, looks like a fern, in Australia, Antarctica, India, Africa, South America. So we find these fossils all through here. And then the plants diverged from there. So they became different after this point. But we have evidence that they came from the same spot, and then they changed later. So we'll talk about geographic isolation again some other time. But what it means is kind of like the camels, when organisms get separated, then they can change their, they end up changing their traits because of different selection pressures. So we see organisms that are very similar on different continents, like the jaguar and the leopard. And the jaguar lives in South America and Central America. The leopard lives in Africa and Asia. Well, there might have been a connection there on a land bridge, and that could explain why they're so similar. Another thing we're going to talk about is anatomy. And so we have a few words when we talk about anatomy. And one is a homologous structure. So remember, homo means the same. And these are structures that on the outside, they look really different. So a bat wing and a whale flipper and a cat arm and a human arm do not look the same on the outside. But on the inside, they do. So we notice that they have a humerus, and they all have a radius and an ulna, the orange and the white. And so they have the same bone structure on the inside. And when they have the same bone structure on the inside, that tells us that they have the same makeup. So they probably have a common ancestor. And that would be, anytime you see these structures that are the same on the inside, that would be a homologous structure. Here's another example that we have succulent plants. They all have a really similar structure. We have cacti that have a similar structure. So those show, those are homologous, as in they have the same internal structure. And they show that there's probably a common ancestor. Now, the opposite of that is an analogous structure. So this is when on the outside they look the same, or similar at least, where these are all wings. So a moth wing, a pterodactyl wing, a pigeon wing, and a bat wing. And yeah, the outside looks the same, and they all help them fly. But if you look at the inside, the structure is not the same. And so these, they've highlighted the bones. So some of the bones are the same, but they're in very different locations. And so this actually shows analogous means they do the same thing, but they don't show a relationship. So all of these structures help them fly, but they don't show a common ancestor. So similar function, similar form, but a different internal structure shows that there's no evolutionary relationship. And really what it comes down to is that because of natural selection, because of these selection pressures, the same form develops. So in the ocean, it's advantageous to be sleek. And organisms that are sleek tend to eat more, reproduce, and survive. And so we see that even fish and dolphins, unrelated organisms, show those traits, right? They all have fins. These are mammals. These are fish. They're not closely related. That's just the sort of look. That's the sort of structure that evolves in the ocean because that's what helps organisms survive. So another anatomy structure is called a vestigial organ. And so these are things that have no function or little function. And so they are remnants, as in they remain from the ancestral species. So we talk about this with whales, that whales have leg bones that are internal. You can't see them. Well, that's a vestigial organ, and it tells us that their ancestors probably had legs. So these could be from mutations that accumulate for structure that doesn't help them survive anymore. And so these fish are cave fish in South America. Well, these are cave fish. These are fish that live just outside the caves. And so they're closely related species. They're obviously very different. These ones have lost pigment. They've lost eyes. And really that's because mutations can happen here where these fish lose eyes and it doesn't really matter. It's not going to keep them from surviving. They can't see anyhow. Whereas here, if they lost eyes, those ones would die. They would get eaten pretty quickly or starve. So in some cases, all these mutations can accumulate and it doesn't change their fitness. It doesn't change whether they can survive or not. So we have some vestigial organs. One is a tailbone. We no longer have a tail, but it suggests that our ancestors did. All mammals have tailbones. Some have tails and some don't. Another vestigial structure is a wisdom tooth. So I don't have any wisdom teeth because I wasn't born with any. Some of us have 4, some of us have 2, some of us have 3, and it seems to be a vestigial structure where other organisms had those teeth to chew, and they were a necessary part of their survival. Here's one of my favorite vestigial organs. This is a boa constrictor. These are the tiny little bones in a boa constrictor, and they're leg bones. So tiny little leg structures. The bone actually moves up through here. So when you look at the skeleton, it's more prominent than just looking at its backside. And then look at this. This is a skink, and a skink is technically a lizard, but look at his tiny, teeny little arms. It's so cute and weird looking. But what does this suggest, these vestigial organs? Do you think it needs these arms to crawl? It slithers like a snake. So these suggest that its ancestor had probably more prominent arms. And this also suggests that the boa constrictor's ancestors had some more prominent legs. This is a skink moving. You can tell it's very snake-like, that these legs aren't going to really help it. Okay, so we've done the anatomy structures. Now we're moving on to embryology. Embryology is looking at the embryos and how embryos developed. So all vertebrate, that means they have a spine, all vertebrate embryos have similar structure. So this is a tortoise and a chick, and you can see that they look very, very similar in the beginning, and they only later in development do they look much different. And what that tells us is that the DNA inside of there is determining the development. And so they share a lot of characteristics because they share a lot of their DNA. And this is a much larger relationship, human to fish and reptile and bird. But in development, all 4 of these have gills. And the only one that needs gills to breathe is a fish. Reptiles, birds, and humans do not need gills. So a bird, they get their oxygen in the egg just through gas exchange through the shell. Reptiles as well. And humans, they get their oxygen from their mother through the umbilical cord. And so the gills don't make sense. They're a vestigial structure. But it tells us that we share ancestry with things that use gills. So it also may suggest that in terms of the big picture of evolution, we moved from aquatic, things that required gills, to terrestrial. Okay, last section, we're talking about DNA and how DNA has a record of evolution. So this is probably the strongest evidence. Darwin didn't have access to DNA. That we know that was discovered in the 50s. And so inheritance is really still just coming along. And now as we've been sequencing the genome of organisms, it's increased our understanding a great deal just in the last 15, 20 years. So scientists compared the DNA and the protein structure of different organisms. And that's because all living things have DNA and RNA. And that in itself is evidence that we share a common ancestor, if everything shares the script, the DNA. So there's some genes that all organisms have. Not all. I shouldn't say all. Most organisms have hemoglobin. That is the protein that helps bind to oxygen in the blood. And cytochrome C is used in cellular respiration. So these are two essential activities that most organisms can do. And if you look down here, we see the number of nucleotide substitutions. So that means the number of mutations in their sequence of hemoglobin. And so when we compare a sheep and a goat right here, so it has 0 nucleotide substitutions for that particular protein. So it obviously has mutations for others, but that means that they share a pretty close relationship. So the x-axis here is how long ago did they separate? How long ago did their common ancestors separate? And so we can see these ones that we know are really similar, like a horse and a donkey. They have, I don't know, maybe 5 changes in the hemoglobin gene. That means they're pretty closely related. Whereas if you look at a pig and a cow, they have maybe 45 changes in their hemoglobin gene, and that amounts to about 54 million years ago that these two species diverged. And so we see less and less relationship as we move up here. So we're counting nucleotide changes. We know that mutations happen during replication, and most of them get fixed, but some of them don't. And so we can kind of infer from that how long ago did these changes happen. Here's another example. This is looking at the protein, again, hemoglobin, and it's looking, instead of the DNA, at the amino acids. So remember, DNA is translated eventually into an amino acid sequence, and that makes the protein. And so we're looking at the same thing. It's still looking at what DNA is produced. But for hemoglobin, humans, of course, share all of it because we're comparing them to ourselves. A rhesus monkey shares 95% of the same amino acids in the sequence, and a mouse is 87, and a frog is 54. So we shouldn't be surprised by this because these are mammals, and so we are going to share similar hemoglobin sequences because we're more closely related to a monkey and a mouse than we are a frog. But it's interesting that even a frog has half of its hemoglobin sequence the same. So it's really fascinating looking at all of life and seeing how closely related our proteins are. This is called a cladogram, but it's showing the same thing. This is, again, looking at an amino acid sequence, showing that with macaques, another type of primate, we have about 8 amino acid differences. So that's pretty close related, whereas a dog has 32. Not very closely related, but more closely related than a lamprey, which is one of the most ancient organisms we have alive today. Okay, I hope that helps. Maybe one last question is, why are our genetic codes even slightly different? Like, why are they even slightly different if we share a common ancestor? And so think about the problem of mutations, that mutations arise, and also some of those mutations can become adaptations, can be helpful. So that should help you answer that last question. I hope you enjoy the human skin color lecture. That's I think that's one of my favorites, just because it's really fascinating to think about how humans have traits that help them survive. Have a good week. I miss you guys, and hopefully I'll see you soon.